Hey Billy, I have your video review here. So what we're going to do first is we're going to watch a few strokes here in 1/8 speed. Excellent. So there's uh, there's a few things that we're going to look at. I tried to prioritize these tips to the biggest movements possible and then kind of work from there. I'm going to give you three different tips. If you think about more than three things, right, usually your mind defaults to working on nothing, right, like having overload. So having three simple cues to work on is usually something that you can go out, think about those three cues over and over and over until it becomes muscle memory, it's second nature, you're doing it without thinking, and then you're ready for the next three tips and then, kind of bringing them together from there. So like you mentioned, positive blade angle is limited. So why is positive blade angle limited when it could be on a line like so? When we're looking at this stroke here, this top arm is completely extended as you're entering into the water. So we have both arms perfectly straight before the blade starts interacting with the water. One of the issues with dynamic motion and kayak, canoe, whatever, especially, is when you work in absolutes, you're always going to fall short, right? So you have a spectrum, right? And if you're on this end of the spectrum or this end of the spectrum, there are pros and cons here and pros and cons here. And ultimately, being good at paddling is finding balance between these two spectrums. So the first balance is you need this top arm bent, right? 90 degrees is what we're looking for as you're interacting with the water. As you complete the stroke, the arm will extend forward, right? But you want this arm to start at 90 degrees and then progress to being straight. So it is again balance where you have the top arm bent, but then it ultimately ends up straight at the end of the stroke. The perfect way to look at this is to watch an athlete throwing a ball, right? If you watch a quarterback throwing a ball, they start with the arm 90 degrees by the side of the head and it extends as they complete the throw. If they started with their arm totally outstretched and then rotated their body and threw it, it would look ridiculous, right? And so when we use that dynamic motion in reverse for us in, kayaking here, right? Starting with this top arm straight is a hindrance in how much leverage you have. Your power triangle is good, right? But the thing that you're lacking is now the positive blade angle. Keeping this arm at 90 degrees here can put that the top hand further back, which will give you more leverage with your tool, right? So as we're using it now, we have some positive blade angle, but by the time the blade is all the way in the water, the blade is neutral, right? So the only time that you're interacting with the entire blade into the water is when the paddle is behind you. This is the weakest phase of the stroke. By keeping that top arm bent, you can effectively get this blade into the water sooner and get this aspect into the water here. Converting your movement to, instead of spending time in the stroke here and starting somewhere up here, right, allows you to get greater leverages. So you don't work any harder. You're using the same amount of leverages and movement. You're just getting more out of them as the paddle is angled in this direction. The moment the paddle is angled in this direction, you can push with 1,000 pounds of pressure on this paddle in this phase, but you're only going to get a couple of 100 pounds of force as return. If you push with 100 pounds of pressure as the blade is positive at the front, and this blade is actually in the water to give you leverage, you're going to multiply the amount of force that you get tremendously. So the top arm, 90 degrees. So when the blade tip is touching the water, you want this hand near your head, right? 90-degree angle. So your hand is going to feel like it's very close to your head, and it is going to give you an angle that looks something like this as opposed to one here, right? So moving this axis back here, And again, if you can be on this line here, now your blade is interacting with the water further forward, and you're getting a lot more dynamic of a stroke. Next thing we want to look at is there's a bit of asymmetry between your strokes. So as you're taking a left side stroke, you can see this elbow is a bit more bent. So on the opposite side, that arm is perfectly straight. This one is slightly more bent. So this is closer to correct, and you want to try and match both sides. Ultimately, this hand could be closer to your head in this direction, and having it at 90 degrees by the side of your head, like you're throwing a ball or throwing a punch or whatever, right? The more extended forward this hand is, the less motion that you get with it, right? So starting with this hand all the way here, as you complete the stroke, you're only getting this much distance. As we're starting the stroke, right, if the top hand is here, as the blade tip is touching the water, so we can see this blade's nowhere near the water yet, but if we start from the top box here and go through, now there's a lot more motion there, right? The longer this line, the more power you're going to have. Looking at the hip drive. So I sent you the video about your leg drive, and you had posted previously about your legs and knees touching the side of your boats, right? Making sure your legs are engaged is like walking, right? You have your legs under you, the muscles are activated, and they're supporting your upper body as you take steps. If your knees were to flare out to the side as you were walking, you would collapse down on yourself. One of the issues with kayaking is as you're sitting, you don't really collapse down if your legs are not helping you because all of your weight is on your sit bones, right? So you don't have this constant reminder that if your legs are not engaged, you get tremendously punished by falling over, right? But you want to rely on your legs to the point that when you're not using them, you feel incapable of moving the boat, right? These legs should be pumping vigorously like you're riding a bicycle. If you're riding a bicycle and only moving your legs a couple of inches, you can't revolve around the pedals and go through that whole elliptical motion, right? This is what we're trying to rely on as we're paddling in the boat here, right? So as we're watching these strokes, right, your knees barely move, right? And it is partly from leaning back and sitting reclined, having the pedals really far away from you, having the knees in a very comfortable position and barely moving them. You have to pump these legs, right? When you're pumping them, they can't just turn off and lean on the side of the boat. You are actively pushing and relying on them. This takes the pressure off of your upper body doing so much work. If you can make your lower body do the work and transfer it up here, your arms are only simply holding onto the paddle and controlling positive blade angle, neutral blade angle, negative blade angle when you're exiting, and the finesse aspect. But when your legs are pumping, they are powering the stroke. So as we're watching here, one of the big limiters in your motion is your legs move maybe a millimeter up and down sometimes, right? You want them to move multiple inches up and down. So that's one of the things is you just have to be very critical every time you get in a boat. If your knees are not moving up and down multiple inches, if your hips are not moving around multiple inches in the bucket where you feel like you're going to spin completely out of it, it is an opportunity to try and find more motion and more movement, more range of motion. If you don't have it, then you can try something different to make more motion. You can move the foot plate closer to you. You can pump your legs and twist your body, whatever it is. But the big learning curve is figuring out how you can use your legs. On the online school, we have a bunch of analogies. On the YouTube videos, we have me demonstrating it and trying to give multiple different analogies. Whatever resonates with you personally is the key. But ultimately, we need to see these legs moving and these hips moving a lot more, right? You can try to exaggerate it. You cannot physically move these legs too much back and forth. You can't move your hips too much back and forth, but you can move them too little. So you always want to be closer to moving what feels like a ridiculous amount as opposed to moving not at all. The last thing that we're going to look at is as we're going through these strokes, let's see if I can get a good angle here. So as we're going through, I have a video on YouTube called Tensioning the Paddle, where we're trying to bend the paddle and bring your elbows towards each other. It's a great one to review. One of the things that it prevents is your wrist goes into flexion up, right? And what this shows us is as you are pushing into the paddle, the joint here breaks and a lot of energy is lost at that joint, right? We want to see this joint flexed forward, right? So you don't want your wrist down or up. You want it neutral. You want it from your forearms to your knuckles to be, you could put a level on there, right? The moment that this joint breaks, all the energy that you create through the body is lost right there before it gets onto the paddle, right? Normally, when we're paddling, the more pressure you can find on the paddle, the more your joints have to absorb that force, right? And if one of the joints breaks, it just means that you're losing pressure at that point. Keeping this wrist from flexing allows you to put more pressure onto the stroke. So this is the left arm. And then when you take your right side stroke, the wrist is curled in the opposite direction. So it's almost doing too much work, right? So with the dominant hand, it's pushing too much. And then with the opposite hand, it's going in the opposite direction where your knuckles are coming towards the body. So it's unable to process that energy without consciously thinking about it. And then we can see that wrist again on that side. Yep, the big thing, keeping this top elbow a little bit bent as the blade tip's touching the water, then extend it through the stroke. Finding a way to move your legs and move your hips more in the bucket. 90% of the time as you're taking strokes, the legs are immobilized, the hips are barely moving, and we should be seeing those moving to a maximum. Literally riding a bicycle. If you stop moving your legs on a bicycle, the thing stops moving. In kayak, you don't have that same one-to-one, but you want to treat it the same way. If your legs stop moving, imagine that your kayak just stops being efficient going through the water. And then the last thing to worry about is going to be the wrists and making sure that they stay neutral. The knuckles to elbow is all a perfectly straight line as you're interacting with the water. Don't let the knuckles flare up as you're going through those strokes each time. So those are the big three. If you have any questions or if you need any other visual guides, feel free to reach out anytime. I can send video of me paddling or other paddlers or whatever it is to try and help cement some of these ideas. If you need drills or anything like that, feel free to reach out anytime. Thanks so much for signing up for the online school. And remember, I am here to help. Reach out to me 24/7 and I'll answer any question anytime.